All right, so welcome to module 6, lecture 16 on the Psalms and the book of Lamentations. It's helpful sometimes, and I think at this point in time, to just quickly look back and think about where we've been. So far in this class, we've explored the Torah, the historical books and the history of Israel, and we've explored the prophets and their message of correction and judgment on the people. In a sense, you could say that we read about the origins of the Hebrew people and followed them all the way through the establishment and then the disintegration of the nations of Israel and Judah, which ultimately led to the exile of the people. Along the way, we learned a little bit about their law, their covenants that they made with God. We learned about holiness. Most recently, we read through the prophets, which gave us kind of a zoomed-in view with respect to everything that was happening around the Hebrew people. So now it's time to move on to Hebrew poetry, starting with the Psalms. And I do want to say that if you want to learn a lot about the heart of people, it's helpful and interesting to read their poets. So, for instance, if you wanted to understand what some of the things that were going on in the United States in the 1960s and in the 1970s, you might want to listen to music by Marvin Gaye or by Creedence Clearwater Revival or who's that big guy that's your singer? Bob Dylan. Yeah, that's who I'm looking for. Their songs and the poetry in their songs really represented the heart and the struggle of many of the things, including civil rights issues that were happening in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. And that's true of poets throughout history. They really share kind of the heart of the people. If you have an Old Testament in front of you right now, or a Bible in front of you, and you just flopped it open in front of you, there's a really good chance if you flopped it open in the middle of the book that you would have run right into the Psalms. The Psalms it's the longest book in the canon, making it absolutely massive. Sometimes the Psalms is called the Psalter, and it's very different from all the books that we've discussed in class so far. So rather than being kind of a unified book with a unified message, what you have here is a collection of hymns. The Psalms were songs, the songs of the people. They were used in worship. They were sung in worship. So it's important to understand that because we don't have most of the musical notations with the Psalms, so we don't know how they were sung, although they're still used often with new music and used in worship today. In fact, the band U2, who was super popular in my day, but obviously not quite so popular today, but they often closed out their concerts by singing Psalm 40. So anyways, the Psalms were songs, and there were 150 total of them collected in the Hebrew Bible. And it's actually very common for cultures in the ancient Near East to collect the songs of their people. One such example of this, which predates even the oldest writings of the Bible by about 1,000 years, can be found from the Sumerians. It was about the year 2300 BC or so that a collection of hymns was written and compiled by a high priestess named Enheduanna, making her arguably the world's first known author. Since this time, hymn writing has always been a prominent form of expression in the ancient world, just as it continues to be today. Because of this, it shouldn't come as any surprise to any of you to see that many of these have found their way into the Old Testament. Overall, the structure of the book of Psalms is divided into 5 sections. So previously, when we discussed the structure of Isaiah, we noted that it arguably had 3 divisions based on narrative and proposed authorship. Scholars tend to go back and forth in this discussion due to its controversial nature. But the divisions found within the book of Psalms are different than this. We know for sure that these divisions were done intentionally. For example, each division ends in a doxology, that is a type of praise to God that leads into the next section. If you want to look at these or spot these for yourself, here's the chapter divisions for all 5 sections of the book. Chapters 1 through 41, 42 through 72, 73 through 89, 90 through 106, and 107 through 150. Perhaps one of the most interesting elements to pay attention to when it comes to the Psalms is genre. Genre has always been a topic of interest in Hebrew poetry. There are loads of genres that scholars have come up with, or genre subjects that scholars have come up with, such as royal psalms, wisdom psalms, healing psalms. However, it's usually best if you focus on the larger dynamics of psalms of lament and psalms of praise. These are really your 2 primary genres. Lament makes up the majority of the Psalms. So the majority of all these songs that are here in the book of Psalms are psalms of lament, or sadness, or grief, or anger. A cause for this type of genre came from the understanding that God was responsible for everything, good and bad. So when God doesn't show up and fix things like you expect him to, then that's something to be concerned about. Because of this, a popular line in the Psalms is, "God, why have you hidden your face? Where are you? Why haven't you shown up?" Praise, on the other hand, expresses the psalmist's belief that God was going to provide and that the tough times were there for a reason and that God would come through in the end. This made the psalmist resoundingly hopeful. They would often express this by recounting past experiences where Yahweh had come through for them. And we know from reading so much of the Old Testament already that there are a lot of stories where God comes through for the people of Israel and delivers them. Right? So the relationship between these 2 primary genres, lament and psalms, is also really interesting. Many have said that lament always transitions from lament to praise. But recently there's been some pushback on that method of thinking. Perhaps it's better to say that lament doesn't always result in praise, but rather the psalmist gives you the circumstances of each, and you're left with this tension of holding both of them independently. One last comment on genre before we transition to a brief conversation on Lamentations. As you read through some of the Psalms for this week, pay attention to when it refers to a king. David is more prevalent towards the beginning, but towards the end, the theme of Yahweh as king becomes more prevalent. In other words, as David decreases in mention, Yahweh increases in mention. One other thing I want to say about the Psalms before we move on to Lamentations is there are some angry Psalms in here. And maybe it's good for us to just know that when we pray, when we talk to God, and Psalms they're songs, but they're also prayers. They're people talking to God and expressing themselves to God through song and through poetry. It is okay to be honest with God. So some of the things that are prayed in the Psalms are really angry things, some of them. Not just, "God, I'm disappointed in you," or "God, why didn't you show up?" But you remember that Israel was defeated by the Assyrians, and Judah was defeated by the Babylonians. And when you're defeated in war, people die, and it's miserable, and it's awful. And people are taken off into captivity, and people suffer, and they starve. And so some of the Psalms that you have, these words of poetry written to God, are people who are angry with God, and they're angry with their circumstances. And they say things that we would never think is okay. Like, "God, I wish that you would take the babies of our enemies and bash them against a tree." We know that that's not okay. But what is okay is being able to pray from your heart and be honest from your heart with God. So I want to say that. And that actually leads us into the book of Lamentations. Lamentations was, it's a relatively short book, but it's significant in light of what we've been learning in our class. Basically, Lamentations is a collection of laments or songs of lament in response to the siege and the subsequent destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. The destruction of a city is a somber occasion in any culture. It's horrible. It's terrible. We obviously haven't witnessed a whole lot of that in the United States, but around the world, people have throughout the years and throughout the centuries, and it's a horrible thing. For example, in about the year 2000 BC, a prominent city in the ancient Near East known as Ur was destroyed. This devastated the people of Ur. Allow me to go ahead and share. The people wrote a document called the Lament for the Destruction of Ur, and I want to share a little portion of it with you. On that day, I did not forsake my city. Truly, I shed tears before the destruction of Ur. I muttered to myself a prayer to my God, saying, "May the city not be destroyed." But they never changed the outcome. They never soothed my heart. They allowed the destruction of the city and the killing of its people. So as you can see, the genre of lament is quite ancient, and the book of Lamentations makes extensive use of it. Lamentations is a very artful compilation. The poetry is very beautiful. To add to its complexity, its text often quotes enemies and observers on top of the narrative that it's describing. Jerusalem is personified and portrayed in various roles. It, or she, the city of Jerusalem, is called the daughter of Zion in chapter 1, verse 6, as well as the former princess, now widowed. She represents the city's regal history as a place chosen by God, but also the pain felt by Jerusalem's former inhabitants over the city's loss. As you read through this emotional text, understanding what was going on, what they were writing about, the context of it, try to reflect on the story so far in the class, the story of God. Reflect on the forming of the covenants and how the Israelites broke them. Reflect on how Yahweh delivered the people from Egypt and how they abandoned him once they got to the promised land. In many ways, the book of Lamentations, as well as the collection of Psalms, expresses the feelings that are rooted in the deep history of the Hebrew people.